It started with the meadow, a wide, sprawling expanse of golden grass that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a storybook, its tall blades swaying gently in the wind, framed by an ancient, shadowy forest. To the townsfolk, the meadow was just part of the landscape, a quiet, unremarkable stretch of land on the edge of the village. But to Claire Harding, the meadow was different. It was where her 6-year-old son, Eli, went missing. Eli had always been a quiet child. Not shy, exactly, but thoughtful. He preferred the company of his sketchbook to the noise of other children, spending hours drawing fantastical creatures and strange, sprawling landscapes. "Mom, have you ever seen the shadow trees?" he asked one evening, his small hands gripping a crayon as he worked on yet another peculiar drawing. Claire glanced at the picture. Tall, spindly black trees, with twisted branches reaching out like claws. "Shadow trees," she repeated, a faint smile on her lips. "No, I don't think so. Where did you see them?" Eli shrugged, his eyes never leaving the paper. "In the meadow?" Claire frowned. "Eli, you've been playing near the meadow again?" "I told you, it's too close to the woods." "It's not safe." "But they're not in the woods," Eli said softly. "They're in the other meadow. The one you can't see." Claire's heart tightened. "What do you mean, other meadow?" Eli didn't answer. He just kept drawing. That was 2 weeks ago. Now, the house was silent. The police had searched the meadow and the surrounding forest for days, their dogs combing through every inch of the land. But there was no sign of Eli. No footprints, no torn fabric, no trail. It was as if he'd simply vanished. The only thing they'd found was his sketchbook, lying open in the middle of the meadow. Claire clutched the book tightly as she sat in Eli's empty bedroom, her eyes red and swollen. The last drawing he'd made before he disappeared was burned into her mind. A small boy standing in a field of tall grass, surrounded by shadowy figures. The town was sympathetic at first. Neighbors brought casseroles, offered to help with the search, and left messages of support on her porch. But as the days turned into weeks, their sympathy turned to avoidance. "Poor Claire," she overheard one woman whisper in the grocery store. "Losing her boy like that. But you know what they say about the meadow?" The other woman nodded grimly. "It's cursed. My grandmother used to tell stories about children going missing there. Said it wasn't just a meadow. It was a doorway." Claire gritted her teeth and pushed her cart past them, ignoring their wide-eyed stares. She didn't believe in curses, or doorways, or shadow trees. At least, not yet. It was on the 21st day after Eli's disappearance that Claire decided to return to the meadow. She had avoided it since the search ended, unable to bear the sight of the place where her son had vanished. But something had changed. She'd woken up that morning with a strange, nagging feeling, a pull in her chest, like a thread tugging her toward the edge of the forest. She clutched Eli's sketchbook tightly as she stepped into the golden grass, her heart pounding with every step. The meadow was eerily quiet, the usual hum of insects and rustling leaves replaced by an unnatural stillness. Claire stopped in the exact spot where the police had found the sketchbook. She knelt down, running her fingers through the grass. "Eli," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know you're out here. Please, give me a sign." For a moment, there was nothing, and then the wind changed. It swept through the meadow with a low, mournful sound, bending the tall grass in a swirling pattern. Claire's hair whipped around her face as she stood, her chest tightening. And then she saw it. A figure. In the distance. It was small, barely more than a silhouette against the golden grass. But there was no mistaking it. It was a child. Claire's breath caught in her throat. "Eli!" she called, her voice cracking. The figure didn't move. She took a hesitant step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Eli, Is that you? The wind picked up again, and the figure turned slowly, its features still obscured by the distance. But there was something wrong. The figure's outline shimmered like a reflection on water, and its shadow stretched too far, twisting unnaturally across the grass. Claire's hands trembled as she clutched Eli's sketchbook to her chest. "Who are you?" she whispered. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering her question. And then, in a voice that was soft and distant, like a faint echo carried on the wind, it spoke. "Come find us." Claire's legs buckled, and she dropped to her knees in the grass. "Us?" she whispered. "What do you mean? Where is my son?" But the figure didn't answer. It simply turned and began walking toward the edge of the forest, its shimmering outline fading into the shadows. Claire scrambled to her feet. "Wait!" she shouted, her voice desperate. She ran after it, her feet pounding against the soft earth. But no matter how fast she ran, the figure stayed just out of reach, its shimmering form slipping further into the trees. By the time she reached the forest's edge, it was gone. But something else was there, a faint marking etched into the bark of a tall, ancient tree, a spiral shape surrounded by jagged lines, exactly like the ones Eli had drawn in his sketchbook. Claire reached out and touched the marking, her fingers trembling. The moment her hand made contact, the forest seemed to shift around her. The trees darkened, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The air grew heavy and cold, and the golden light of the meadow was replaced by an eerie, bluish glow. Claire's breath hitched. The forest had changed, and she was no longer alone. The forest was alive, in ways Claire couldn't understand. The trees groaned and whispered as if the wind carried secrets through their twisted branches. The air was cold and damp, thick with the faint scent of moss and decay. Shadows stretched unnaturally, curling and twisting along the ground, moving even when there was no light to cast them. Claire gripped Eli's sketchbook tightly, her breaths coming quick and shallow. "Eli?" she called, her voice trembling. The sound of her own voice seemed to vanish into the forest, swallowed by the oppressive silence. But then, faintly, she heard it. A child's laughter. It was soft and distant, but unmistakable. Claire's chest tightened. "Eli!" She stumbled forward, her feet crunching against the brittle underbrush as she followed the sound. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the trees like a melody she couldn't quite place. But something was wrong. It wasn't just Eli's laughter she heard. There were others. The laughter faded as Claire pushed deeper into the forest, replaced by a faint humming sound that seemed to come from all around her. She stopped to catch her breath, her hand brushing against the bark of a tree. The rough surface was cold and damp, but beneath her fingertips she felt something carved into the wood. She stepped back, holding the flashlight she'd brought up to the tree. Another spiral marking, surrounded by jagged lines. Her heart pounded as she flipped through Eli's sketchbook, landing on a page where he'd drawn the same symbol over and over again. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. She turned, shining the flashlight along the path she'd come. More spirals. They were carved into almost every tree, each one glowing faintly as if the light from her flashlight had awakened something dormant. The forest seemed to shift again, the trees pressing closer together, their gnarled branches forming a canopy so dense that no natural light could penetrate it. And then she heard it. "Mom." Claire froze. The voice was small, soft, and unmistakably Eli's. Her heart leaped into her throat. "Eli!" "Over here," the voice called, faint but clear. She turned sharply, shining the flashlight in the direction of the voice. The beam cut through the shadows, illuminating a narrow path that twisted deeper into the forest. Claire hesitated. The path seemed impossibly dark, its edges blurring as if it didn't truly exist. But then she heard him again. "Mom, I'm here." The desperation in his voice shattered her hesitation. She ran. The path seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. The shadows moved unnaturally around her, curling and shifting as if they were alive. The faint humming sound grew louder, vibrating in her chest like an unseen force pulling her forward. Finally, the path opened into a small clearing. Claire stopped abruptly, her flashlight shaking in her hands as she scanned the space. At the center of the clearing stood a tree, unlike any she had ever seen. Its trunk was massive, its blackened bark twisted and scarred with countless spiral markings. The branches stretched impossibly high, disappearing into the darkness above. The air around it seemed heavier, colder, as if the tree was draining the life from everything nearby. And beneath the tree, standing perfectly still, was Eli. "Eli!" Claire cried, dropping the flashlight and running toward him. He didn't move. When she reached him, she dropped to her knees, pulling him into her arms. His small body was cold, and his clothes were damp, but he didn't resist her embrace. "Eli, oh my God," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I'd lost you. Are you okay? What happened? Where have you been?" Eli didn't answer. Claire pulled back, looking into his face. His wide, dark eyes stared past her, unfocused and empty. "Eli," she said softly, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "Honey, it's me. It's Mom." Slowly, his lips parted. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered. Claire's stomach dropped. "What? Eli, what are you talking about?" His gaze shifted slightly, locking onto hers for the first time. "They don't want you here," he said, his voice trembling. "They're watching." Before Claire could respond, the shadows in the clearing shifted. The air grew colder, and the faint hum she'd heard before turned into a low, guttural growl. She turned sharply, her eyes scanning the darkness. And then she saw them. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, their outlines flickering like distorted reflections in a broken mirror. They were tall and thin, their limbs impossibly long, and their faces shrouded in darkness. Their eyes glowed faintly, hollow and pale, as they moved silently toward the clearing. Claire's breath hitched. "Eli, we have to go," she said, grabbing his hand and pulling him to his feet, but he didn't move. "They won't let us leave," he whispered. Claire's chest tightened as the figures drew closer, their movements slow and deliberate. "Stay behind me," she said, her voice shaking. She picked up the flashlight and shone it at the nearest figure. The beam cut through its form, revealing a swirling mass of shadows that writhed and twisted unnaturally. The figure recoiled slightly, but it didn't stop. Claire's mind raced as she backed away, clutching Eli's hand tightly. "What do you want?" she shouted into the darkness. The figures didn't respond, but then, from somewhere deep within the forest, a voice echoed. Soft, melodic, inhuman. "He belongs to us." Claire's blood turned to ice. "No!" she shouted. "He's my son! You can't have him!" The voice laughed softly, a sound like wind rustling through dead leaves. "You cannot take what was given freely." Claire turned to Eli, her heart pounding. "Eli, what does that mean? What did you do?" Tears welled in his wide, dark eyes. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. "I just wanted to see them. The shadow trees. They said I could stay if I promised." His voice broke. "If you promised what?" Claire demanded. Eli's gaze dropped to the ground. "To never leave." The figures closed in, their glowing eyes locking onto Claire. The air around her grew heavy, her limbs trembling as an unseen force pressed against her chest. She pulled Eli close, her voice firm, despite the panic rising in her throat. "You can't have him," she said through clenched teeth. "You can't take him from me." The voice returned, colder now, its tone sharp and final. "He is already ours. And now, so are you." The ground beneath her feet shifted, and the shadows surged forward, engulfing them in darkness. Claire's screams echoed through the forest, swallowed by the ancient, hungry silence of the meadow. Darkness wrapped around Claire like a suffocating blanket, cold and damp. She held Eli close, her breath ragged, as the shadows swirled and twisted around them. For a moment, she felt weightless, as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. And then, she landed hard on a cold, uneven surface. The impact knocked the air from her lungs, and for a moment she couldn't move. When she opened her eyes, the world around her had changed. They were no longer in the clearing. The shadows had receded, leaving them in what looked like a vast, hollow cavern. The walls were made of smooth, black stone that shimmered faintly in the dim light. The ceiling stretched high above them, vanishing into darkness, and the air was thick with the faint hum Claire had heard in the forest. At the center of the cavern stood the tree. It was even larger now, its twisted branches reaching into the void above. Its blackened bark glistened like obsidian, and the spiral markings etched into its surface pulsed with a faint, eerie light. Claire pushed herself to her feet, pulling Eli up with her. "Where are we?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Eli clutched her hand tightly, his wide eyes fixed on the tree. "This is where they live," he said softly. "The shadow trees." Claire's chest tightened as she looked around the cavern. The air was heavy, pressing against her chest with every breath. The faint hum grew louder, vibrating in her bones as if the cavern itself was alive. The shadows began to move again, pooling at the base of the tree and forming into tall, thin figures. They stepped forward slowly, their glowing eyes locking onto Claire and Eli. "You shouldn't have come here," one of them said, its voice sharp and fragmented like a whisper carried on the wind. Claire stepped in front of Eli, her fists clenched. "You took my son," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "I'm here to take him back." The figure tilted its head, its form shifting like smoke. "He came to us willingly," it said. "He saw the beauty of our world and wished to stay." Claire glanced down at Eli, her stomach churning. "Is that true?" Eli's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know what it meant," he whispered. "I just wanted to see the shadow trees. They promised they'd show me if I stayed." Claire's heart ached as she knelt beside him, gripping his shoulders tightly. "You're just a child, Eli. You didn't know what you were agreeing to. We're leaving. Together." The figures stepped closer, their glowing eyes narrowing. "No one leaves," one of them said coldly. "The promise has been made. The boy belongs to us now." Claire stood, her jaw tightening. "You can't just take him. He's my son." The figures didn't respond. Instead, the tree began to move. Its massive branches creaked and twisted, casting jagged shadows across the cavern walls. The spiral markings on its bark glowed brighter, and the hum in the air grew louder. Eli clung to Claire's side, his small body trembling. "Mom, they're angry," he whispered. Claire pulled him closer, her mind racing. She had no idea how to fight whatever these things were, but she wasn't about to let them take her son. "Why him?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Why do you want him so badly?" The figures stopped, their forms flickering like dying flames. "The boy sees," one of them said. "He sees the doorways. He sees the worlds beyond. He is special." Claire's chest tightened. "Doorways? What are you talking about?" The figure tilted its head again. "The meadow is a threshold," it said, "a place where worlds touch. Few can see it for what it truly is. Your son is one of them. That is why he must stay." Claire shook her head. "No, you can't have him. I don't care what you think he is. He's my son, and we're leaving." The figures didn't respond. Instead, the shadows around them began to rise, curling and twisting like smoke. The cavern grew colder, and the hum in the air turned into a low, guttural growl. The tree's branches began to stretch downward, their twisted ends glowing faintly as they reached for Claire and Eli. Claire grabbed Eli's hand and pulled him back, her heart pounding. "Run!" she shouted. They sprinted across the cavern, their footsteps echoing against the smooth stone. The shadows followed, their movements swift and unnatural, closing in from all sides. Eli stumbled, and Claire caught him, lifting him into her arms as she pushed forward. Ahead, she saw a faint glimmer of light, a doorway etched into the cavern wall, its edges glowing faintly with the same spirals that marked the trees. "This way," she shouted, her voice cracking. The doorway seemed impossibly far, the shadows closing in with every step. The figures behind them whispered softly, their fragmented voices forming an eerie chorus. You cannot escape. The boy is ours. The promise must be kept. Claire gritted her teeth, her legs burning as she pushed herself faster. The doorway's light grew brighter, casting long shadows across the cavern floor, but just as she reached it, a massive branch slammed down in front of her, blocking the path. She stumbled back, clutching Eli tightly as the shadows surrounded them. The figures stepped closer, their glowing eyes locking onto Eli. The boy will stay, one of them said, and you will forget. Claire's hands trembled as she held Eli close. No, she said through clenched teeth. I won't let you take him. The figures didn't respond. Instead, the cavern began to shift again, the walls twisting and bending as if the entire space was alive. The tree's branches creaked and groaned, curling around Claire and Eli like a cage. Eli buried his face in her chest, his small body trembling. Mom, I'm scared, he whispered. Claire's eyes filled with tears as she held him tightly. It's going to be okay, she said, her voice trembling. I promise. But deep down, she wasn't sure if she could keep that promise. The figures reached for Eli, their shadowy limbs stretching toward him, and then a faint whisper cut through the air. It wasn't coming from the figures or the tree. It was coming from Eli's sketchbook. Claire's eyes widened as she opened the book, her fingers trembling. The pages glowed faintly, the spirals and jagged lines seeming to come alive. The whispers grew louder, forming words that echoed in her mind. The promise can be broken, but only at a cost. Claire's chest tightened. What cost? She whispered. The sketchbook didn't respond, but the light from its pages grew brighter, pushing back the shadows. The figures recoiled slightly, their forms flickering. Claire's mind raced as she held the book tightly. If there was a way to break the promise, she had to find it, even if it meant facing the full wrath of the shadows. The glowing pages of the sketchbook illuminated the cavern, casting flickering light across the shadowy figures. The hum of the tree grew louder, a sound that vibrated in Claire's chest, heavy and relentless. The promise can be broken, the words repeated in her mind, whispered from the sketchbook. The figures recoiled slightly, their movements hesitant now, as if the book's light was a barrier they couldn't cross. Claire gripped it tightly, her knuckles white. What cost? She asked aloud, her voice echoing in the cavern. The figures didn't respond, but the tree did. Its branches groaned and twisted, the spiral markings on its bark glowing brighter. From deep within its trunk came a low, resonant voice, layered and otherworldly. The cost is you. Claire's stomach dropped. What does that mean? The glowing spirals in the sketchbook began to shift, forming new patterns, words etched across the page in twisting, jagged lines. The bond must be replaced. A life for a life. Claire stared at the words, her heart pounding. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, there has to be another way. The voice from the tree rumbled again, cold and final. The boy is ours. If you wish to take his place, the bond will hold. Eli clutched her tightly, his small hands trembling. Mom, don't, he whispered, his voice breaking. Please don't leave me. Tears streamed down Claire's face as she held him close. I'm not going to let them take you, Eli. I'll figure this out. I promise. But the tree's branches curled closer, their sharp tips glowing faintly. The figures began to step forward again, their hollow eyes fixed on Eli. The boy will stay, one of them said, its voice sharp and fragmented. Claire's grip on the sketchbook tightened. No, she said firmly, her voice trembling with defiance. He's not staying. You're not taking him. The spirals on the pages pulsed brightly, pushing the shadows back again. The tree groaned, its branches twisting violently as if it was resisting the power of the book. Claire flipped through the pages desperately, searching for something, anything, that could save Eli without sacrificing herself. And then she found it, A drawing she didn't recognize. The image was of the tree, its massive branches stretching upward, surrounded by glowing spirals. But at its base was a faint doorway, carved into the trunk itself, its edges glowing with the same light as the spirals. Beneath the drawing, words were scrawled in Eli's handwriting. The door leads to the roots. Break the roots, break the bond. Claire's heart raced. The roots! The tree groaned again, its voice thundering through the cavern. You cannot break the roots. The bond is eternal. But the sketchbook told a different story. Claire stood, pulling Eli behind her as she stepped toward the tree. The shadowy figures hissed and shrank back as the glowing light from the book intensified, illuminating the cavern walls. Stay behind me, she whispered to Eli. He nodded, his small hand clutching her sleeve tightly. The closer Claire got to the tree, the heavier the air became. It pressed against her chest, each step feeling like she was wading through water. The spirals on the tree's bark glowed brightly, pulsing in rhythm with the hum that filled the cavern. At the base of the tree, just as the drawing had shown, was a faint doorway. Its edges shimmered, and the jagged lines of a spiral were etched into its surface. Claire reached out, her fingers brushing against the door. It was cold to the touch, and the moment her hand made contact, a jolt of energy shot through her, almost knocking her off her feet. The tree roared, its branches twisting violently as the shadows surged forward. You cannot break the bond! The figures shouted in unison, their voices overlapping in a deafening chorus. Claire gritted her teeth, pushing the door open with all her strength. It creaked and groaned, the spirals glowing brighter as it slowly swung inward. Beyond the door was a tunnel, descending into darkness. The roots, Claire said, her voice steady, despite the fear gnawing at her. She turned to Eli, her hands on his shoulders. Stay here, okay? Don't move. His eyes filled with tears. Mom, I'm scared. She pulled him into a tight hug. I know, sweetheart. But I have to do this. I'll be back. I promise. Eli nodded, reluctantly, his small hands clutching the sketchbook. Claire stepped through the doorway, her heart pounding as she descended into the darkness. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls lined with the same glowing spirals that marked the tree. The air was colder here, damp and heavy with the scent of earth and decay. The hum of the tree grew louder, vibrating in her chest as she moved deeper into its core. Finally, the tunnel opened into a chamber. The roots of the tree stretched across the space like veins, thick and black, pulsing faintly with glowing light. The spirals etched into their surface shifted and twisted, as if they were alive. At the center of the chamber was a heart, pulsating with the same rhythmic glow. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She knew instinctively that this was the source, the core of the tree's power. She stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the heart. The spirals on its surface seemed to ripple, forming shapes that looked almost like faces, anguished and screaming, trapped within the glowing lines. The tree's voice echoed through the chamber, cold and furious. You will not break the bond. The boy is ours. Claire ignored it, her focus unwavering. She picked up a jagged rock from the ground, its edges sharp and cold. Not anymore, she said through clenched teeth. Nah. She raised the rock high above her head and brought it down with all her strength. The heart cracked. A deafening roar filled the chamber as the spirals on the roots flared brightly, their light blinding. The ground trembled beneath Claire's feet, and the walls of the chamber began to splinter. She struck the heart again and again, each blow sending cracks spiderwebbing across its surface. The tree's voice screamed, its fury shaking the cavern. You will destroy us all. That's the idea, Claire muttered, driving the rock into the heart one final time. The heart shattered, its glowing fragments exploding outward in a blinding flash of light. The roots writhed and twisted violently, their spirals fading as the tree's power began to collapse. Claire stumbled back, shielding her eyes as the chamber around her began to crumble. She turned and ran, her legs burning as she sprinted up the tunnel. When she emerged back into the cavern, the shadows were gone. The tree's branches were still, its bark dull and lifeless. The glowing spirals had faded completely, leaving only faint etchings in the blackened wood. Eli stood where she'd left him, clutching the sketchbook tightly. "Mom!" he cried, running toward her. Claire dropped to her knees, pulling him into a tight hug. "It's over," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's over." But deep down, she wasn't sure if that was true. The cavern was eerily silent. The once towering tree stood lifeless, its blackened bark cracked and brittle. The spirals etched into its surface no longer glowed, leaving faint scars that twisted across its massive trunk. Claire held Eli tightly, her heart pounding as she scanned the now empty chamber. The shadows that had surrounded them moments ago had vanished, leaving only the faint hum of the earth settling around them. "It's over," she whispered again, more to herself than to Eli. But Eli didn't respond. He clutched the sketchbook tightly, his small body trembling against hers. When Claire pulled back to look at him, her chest tightened. His wide, dark eyes were fixed on the lifeless tree. "Eli," she said softly, brushing his hair back. "We have to go." For a moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he nodded. The climb back through the forest was grueling. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The trees seemed darker now, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms. But the spirals were gone. The markings that had once glowed faintly in the bark had faded completely, leaving no trace of the strange, ancient power that had controlled the forest. Claire kept Eli close as they made their way toward the meadow, her every step cautious. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though no shadows moved in the corners of her vision. When they finally emerged into the golden grass, the sunlight was blinding. Claire shielded her eyes, her chest heaving as she took in the sight of the meadow. It looked normal. No glowing spirals, no shadowy figures, just tall grass swaying gently in the breeze. Eli tugged at her sleeve, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, are we safe now?" Claire knelt down, holding his face in her hands. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said honestly. "But we're together, and that's all that matters." He nodded, his small hands clutching hers tightly. They returned to the village in silence. The streets were quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Claire felt the weight of the townsfolk's stares as she walked toward their home, Eli at her side. Whispers followed them, but she didn't care. She locked the door behind them and pulled the curtains shut, shutting out the world. Eli sat on the couch, clutching his sketchbook as if it were a lifeline. Claire sat beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "You're safe now," she said softly. "I won't let anything happen to you." He looked up at her, his wide eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to." "Shh," she said, pulling him into a hug. "It's not your fault, Eli. None of this is your fault." But as she held him, a nagging thought crept into her mind. The tree was destroyed. The spirals were gone. But the forest still stood. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind against the windows made her heart race. She sat in the living room, staring at the sketchbook on the coffee table. The drawings hadn't changed. The spirals, the shadowy figures, the twisted trees, they were all still there, as if waiting. Claire reached for the book with trembling hands, flipping through its pages. Her breath hitched when she reached the last drawing. It was new. She was sure it hadn't been there before. The image was of the meadow, but it wasn't empty. In the center stood a figure, tall and thin, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the grass. Beneath the drawing were 3 words, scrawled in jagged handwriting. "It's not over." The knock on the door came just before dawn. Claire froze, her heart leaping into her throat. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, pretending she wasn't home. But the knock came again, louder this time, echoing through the house. She stood slowly, her hands trembling as she approached the door. When she opened it, no one was there. Just the faint rustling of the wind and the distant hum of the forest. But at her feet was an envelope. It was old and yellowed, the edges frayed. Her name was written on the front in elegant, looping handwriting. With shaking hands, she picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a single piece of paper. The forest is quiet for now, but it is never truly gone. The bond was broken, but its echoes remain. Take your son and leave this place, Claire. Leave before it calls again. The note was unsigned. Claire's chest tightened as she stepped back inside, locking the door behind her. She looked down at Eli, who was still asleep on the couch, his small chest rising and falling steadily. She didn't need to be told twice. By noon, the house was packed. Claire loaded the last of their belongings into the car, her every movement quick and deliberate. Eli climbed into the back seat, his sketchbook clutched tightly to his chest. "Where are we going?" he asked softly. "Somewhere far away," Claire said, starting the engine. As they drove out of the village, Claire glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette framed by the fading afternoon light. She didn't look back again. But as they left, deep within the forest, something stirred. The spirals that had faded began to glow faintly once more, their light pulsing softly in the bark of the ancient trees. And in the meadow, a shadow moved. It stretched long and thin across the golden grass, its edges curling like smoke. The forest wasn't done, not yet,